Hi everyone, welcome to my show. Got a few interesting things I want to talk about today, maybe of not interest to you, but who cares? Because we're in a space whereby we talk about anything to anybody, and usually on my YouTube page, that's to nobody. And I want to thank all those people that jumped on board a week or so ago when we talked about protest. And we're talking about protests again. And this time I'm talking specifically about how shitty Americans are at protesting about things that are happening in Australia, when in actual fact, you've got no idea what is happening here at all. I'm not suggesting that this is fake news. What I am suggesting is that I live here and therefore I probably should know. And it was interesting that in the US this week, there was a protest in front of the Australian Embassy, I think it is, in New York, or at least a place that represents Australia. And there was an article in Yahoo News which talked a little bit about this, and I thought that was interesting, and I'd just like to wander through that article with you because it makes some interesting statements about Americans in particular. Now, I don't want to get people to the impression that I believe all Americans are crazy, even though I believe that probably 1/3 of them are pretty crazy indeed. But certainly I don't want you to start thinking that I'm bashing America. Been to America a couple of times, love the people generally, and but I think your politics is stuffed. I think you're a crazy group of people when it comes to politics in particular, and I think you're a crazy group of people when it comes to criticising us for what it is that we have been doing. In this particular space around the coronavirus, it was interesting to see Chris Haynes talk about this on MSNBC. I should actually have a copy of that here and should have shown you. But Chris talked about the comparison between what's happening in Australia and comparing that to Florida, primarily because Florida has a population of 22 million, Australia has a population of 24 million. We have had here in Australia 1,400 deaths. You in Florida have had 64,000. Now, when we compare the two, it is evident that whatever we are doing here in Australia with a comparative population to Florida is saving lives. And I think that that's what's important to recognise here, is that we're in the business of saving as many lives as we can, not destroying them like you do in Florida and other parts of the US. So who's right? At the end of the day, it is really about which system is the best health measure that any system could have. Now, I'm not suggesting for a moment that here in Australia we're perfect, because we ain't. And I might go into that a little bit later, but we make mistakes and we do things sometimes pretty poorly, mainly because we have politicians, just like you have politicians, and most of those politicians are primarily interested in looking after themselves. So they don't really care about you or I, providing they're being fed, housed appropriately, being able to fly around in private jets, and possibly in some cases receiving donations from people whom they shouldn't be receiving those donations from in the first place. And those donations obviously influence how it is they choose to vote and what they choose to do with while in Parliament. So we have similar issues. We don't have them to the same extent as you are. I'm not making that as an excuse. I'm not saying it's just because you've got a population of around 350 million and we've only got a population of 24 million. I'm saying that that's just politics, and that's the way it is, and we suffer in a similar sort of way to the way they do in the US. But I want to bring back to this article and this conversation around protesting for us, because it raises some interesting issues for me as to what makes you think, you people that are protesting about Australia, what makes you think, number one, you understand us, number two, you actually know what's going on, and number three, whether you're interested in the health consequences of the coronavirus and how that's impacting people around the world, particularly you guys, because obviously you don't care. So as we go through this article, so there was video footage of this riot, anti-vaxxers on the streets of New York and chanting this support for Australia, and they really do. This has been mocked online because it is a wee bit of a joke. We have a whole host of anti-vaxxers here. You know what? we're now over 80% of Australians have had their first shot. Over 80%. We're up around 70% in some states with their second shot. And once we get to 70%, we start to open up slowly, as they're doing next week in New South Wales. So we're making progress. In fact, New South Wales, I think, is leading the world now in the number of second doses that have been had, or close to, I think we're fourth. So we're doing pretty well, considering that and I live, guys, for those of you that are interested, anybody watching us from the US, for those that are interested, I live in South Australia. We have 0 COVID cases, and we can very much do whatever we like, except we do have to wear masks when we're outside or we're close to other people. But here in Australia, we're relatively, it interests me that Australians generally have been known as a group of people that are rebellious. If you want to fight it with somebody in a battlefield, Australians are great people to be with because we fight to the end. And we have a great sense of value and what it means, I guess, to be an Australian, even though we don't talk about it like you guys talk about your sense of patriotism, as if you're the only patriot people on this planet. We don't talk about it generally. Some do, particularly on the right. But for most of us, we believe in our country, believe in our rights, and we celebrate our rights by just simply living the best lives that we can. But in the US, you guys seem to believe that you have, You have innate rights that the rest of the world doesn't tend to have, and that therefore you are superior to the rest of us. And that's crap. Because you're not superior to anybody, no one's superior to anybody else. So, but in this particular article, and I could go on about that forever, but the large group filmed by an independent journalist surrounds the city's Australian consulate, not Australian embassy, on Monday. I guess the embassy must be in Washington, I would imagine, with banners and signs protesting COVID vaccine mandates. We're holding the line for Australia, they say. We support Australia. One woman could be yelled on a megaphone. Probably never been to Australia. Doesn't know where, I think they mentioned that here somewhere. Doesn't know where Australia is even on the map. I reckon I always find that interesting when you ask people to name where Australia is, and they wander around the map thinking that everything exists in the southern hemisphere, not knowing that we're down in the northern hemisphere, not knowing that we're down in the southern hemisphere, and that whenever they draw a map of Australia, they always leave off one of our states, which is Tasmania. The maskless crowd, of course they're maskless, because you can do whatever you like in the United States, then begins to chant, "We support Australia," repeatedly. Some people could be seen waving Australian flags in the air, and I was curious as to where they got the Australian flags from, because I would be surprised if they were sold in souvenir shops. Maybe they are. The strange moment was a part of large protests during which people jeered at diners at restaurants, a privilege reserved for fully vaccinated patrons. My God. So if you're fully vaccinated in the US, then you can go to restaurants and other places, which will be the case here in Australia very soon. I read today, in fact, that if you're that by Christmas, travel will open up between states. Because we've been very strict in regard to the restrictions that each state has in terms of governing our borders. It's very similar to the US, I guess, but there's no way in the world in the US that people would have that there would have been a great deal of objection if people were told that they couldn't enter from one state to another. Well, in this country, you can't fly from one state to another without an exemption. And there are certain restrictions about flying from states that have got the virus. So, for example, here in South Australia, we could fly to Queensland. We used to have to fly if we wanted to fly to Queensland, we'd have to quarantine, even though we don't have any cases here in Australia. So we have been able to cut off our borders. Western Australia, which is our largest state, specifically has closed their borders to the rest of the country. That's primarily because Western Australia seem to think of themselves as another country altogether, kind of a bit like Texas, I guess. But they have very few cases over there. The recent cases, I think, came aboard a ship, but basically they have all their freedoms. And here in South Australia, we have most of our freedoms, apart from wearing masks and social distancing. But and a number of people attending weddings and so forth. But primarily in places like New South Wales and Victoria, no, that's not the case. In fact, Victoria has got 1,400 new cases today, and New South Wales is 600 odd. So there's been some. So we're getting to a point where, to understand this, some states are closed. Some states, like South Australia, are very wary of other states, and we don't want the virus into our state. So we're very, we've got sort of an enclave around our particular state, and I think this is really important for us because it's nice to be able to have all those freedoms. I have a son who lives in Sydney, and I know that their freedoms are somewhat restricted, even though they're slowly being eased. And, you know, folks, it is important to understand that as uncomfortable as the restrictions are, and just remember that in Victoria, I think they are now the only place in the world that's had the longest shutdown, well over 250 days or something of shutdowns in that state since the pandemic has hit. And people suffer. I understand all of that. But if I had a choice between being locked up, potentially getting the virus and dying, I'm going to choose being locked up. And I think most people will. And it is still evident that most of the people that are being hospitalised and those people are dying are 80 to 90% unvaccinated people. So get vaccinated. Back to the article. The Masters crowd that began chanting, "We support Australia." The strange moments was a part of a larger protest during which people jeered at diners at restaurants, blah, blah, blah. I read that. However, many Australians were not impressed by the group's antics. I can understand that. Not impressed myself. With several poking fun at the footage on Twitter. Gee, well, as an Australian, I would say sorry about your own country, mates, one man said. And that's what I was saying. You know, look after your own country before you get concerned about ours. We're not a third world country. We're not an autocracy either. In fact, in many ways, we're far more democratic than you guys are. So, you know, give us a break. Half these people couldn't point to Australia on a map, as I was saying. Yeah, we're good, thanks. Third man chimed in. They're going to be gutted to find out we have universal public health insurance and no guns, one woman. And I think that's a really interesting issue. And I thought of that before I read this article, actually. I thought, well, the thing about Australia is that, like your neighbours in Canada, we have a fabulous health scheme. Now, I don't know how much it costs you to get a test for COVID. I'm not too sure it's free. I did hear someone say that they went for a test. I think it was Dave Packman, actually. He went for a test and it cost him $200. Now, I'm not too sure whether that's factual or not, or whether that was just when he was returning from overseas. But here in Australia, it doesn't cost you anything. You know, we have 60, 70,000, even 100,000 people a day getting tested. And it doesn't cost anybody anything. And if we're hospitalised, and that is, you know, like on a ventilator even, that is completely free. All our hospital services are free, apart from some elective surgery and some medication. But most medication, I went and got some medication for high blood pressure, for example, a week ago. It cost me $7. So I don't know why you people think that you're particularly free in the US, because you ain't. And that's you're doing because you choose governments that have got no sense of community welfare and are not interested in at all of improving the general well-being of the people in your country, particularly African Americans, immigrants, and your Indigenous population. So before you start throwing stones at us, folks, just remember that you need to get your act together first before you start criticising a country like Australia. Goes on to say, this is the most bizarre thing ever. 700k deaths later, and they think we're the ones needing support. We don't want support. Get vaccinated, a man urged. I absolutely support all of that. So I just want to say that, we need to find ways to work together to overcome some of these problems. In the United States at the moment, you might be running out of money in a couple of weeks. Certainly don't come looking anywhere else, particularly to places like Australia and other Western countries to bail you out, because that ain't going to happen. But you create these problems yourselves. Better communication, better health messages, better ways of confronting the extreme right within your country, getting rid of the politicians that play a part in propagating the lies and the mistruths about COVID and other stuff would be really, really helpful. But you don't. You allow those people to kind of develop and to grow, and they're kind of like a feeding farm to all the other crazies that are out there. And as a result of that, you wind up with a crazy government. You wind up with people that don't know how to govern. You just spent 4 years with Donald Trump, for Christ's sake. Surely you've got some idea as to what is a good government at this particular point. And I just want to say on that issue, I was fascinated with the fact that there's a whole host of tell-all books. I don't know if anybody's counting, I guess somebody is, the number of tell-all books that have come out after a president has left office. But in the United States, there are many of them. And some of those people were loyalists to Donald Trump at some particular point. So what's caused them to turn against this man? It is because if a person like Donald Trump holds so much power and influence through fear, when you remove that fear, in other words, when that person fails to have the power to enact some of his threats towards you and to others, then people become resentful. And those resentful people that have, for some reason, been fearful of Donald Trump and who believe he's no longer an influence in United States politics to the extent that he was as president, then those people are going to come out and shit all over you. No doubt about it whatsoever. And at the moment, that's exactly what they're doing. So thanks everybody for being with me on this edition of my show. Take care, look after yourselves, and be safe.